Hey guys, Wyatt Claypool here. I think recent events have proven why Canadian conservatives, and especially conservative politicians, need to care about the issue of judicial appointments. I know it feels very American to be talking about it, and the media are going to attack you as a conservative politician for bringing up the issue, but it matters. And by the way, it's not exactly paying electoral dividends to not talk about it. I think there's actually a lot of Canadians out there who want conservatives to take on the issue of all these far leftists overseeing our courtrooms, giving out very light sentences to actual violent criminals. At the same time, we currently have the Crown prosecutor trying to get 7 and 8 years in the case of Tamara Lich and Chris Barber for the crime of mischief, which they are calling mass mischief in the courtroom today. I'm not sure if a sentence has come out in that case. It may have already come out by the time this video is done. It might take multiple days. Who knows? But even if the judge ends up just giving them time served, the fact that this case ever found that Tamara and Chris were guilty of what? Having a protest in an empty city in which they weren't even the leaders of it. That's the funny thing. Tamara Lich and Chris Barber were not the leaders of the convoy because there were no leaders of the convoy. If after the first week Tamara and Chris Barber or anyone else associated with the convoy just got into a car and left the city, it would just keep going on. There were like a week at a time when you wouldn't even hear anything from anyone in the supposed leadership because that wasn't the point. But for some reason, they are now not only convicted for doing this, but potentially facing prison time. At the same time, again, violent criminals get basically nothing, or they get let out of prison early, or judges are trying to push to not even sentence them for anything because that could risk their immigration status. It's also stupid. But, anyways, before I get into it, I just want to remind you guys, hey, if you like this show, make sure to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you are not yet a subscriber, and leave a comment on what you think about this issue. But let's start off with what Federal Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre said, and I think it is very good he made a statement. I know a lot of people are arguing why he shouldn't, or why it's good if he doesn't sound off on it, or why he can't, but he should, he did, and it was the right thing to do. Pierre Poilievre says here, let's get this straight. While rampant violent offenders are released hours after their most recent charges and anti-Semitic rioters vandalize businesses, terrorize daycares, and block traffic without consequences, the Crown wants 7 years prison time for the charge of mischief for Lich and Barber. How is this justice? And it definitely is not justice at all. But now let's go through some headlines regarding actual criminals, not people committing quote unquote mischief, but people committing violent offenses and what's going on with judges and those people. Well, let's start off with this headline from Juno News. Judge stalls guilty plea for homicide linked immigrant over likely deportation. A Canadian judge hit the brakes on a guilty plea from a non-citizen linked to a homicide and facing serious criminal charges, citing discomfort with the fact that the accused would likely be deported. And it's good reporting by Alex Zoltan here from the True North Wire service for Juno News. And that is nuts that we have a dullard like that, some crazy left-wing activist, actually a judge in a courtroom. This person has judgment on cases like this when they would let somebody being deported determine whether or not they want to accept a guilty plea from somebody who obviously did it if they are actually trying to plead guilty. I'm not sure if they were responsible for the murder or they were just linked to the murder happening and they, assisted in it. But what? Because of the politics of the time, the person doesn't want to see a poor immigrant deported who was involved in a murder case. It just demonstrates where these people's headspaces are at. Let's move on to another one. And by the way, I did not try hard in order to actually get these. It would defeat the purpose if I tried really hard to get headlines to talk about here, because that would show that it doesn't happen all that often. It took me 2 minutes to find these headlines. Another one from Juno News. Life sentence killer charged with new murder months after receiving parole. Jeremiah Valentine, 43, who was sentenced to life in prison for killing 15-year-old Jane Kariba during a notorious 2005 gang shooting in Toronto, has been charged with first-degree murder in Montreal. So the person was convicted in 2005, and they're already out on the streets in 2025 to kill somebody else. That they didn't even serve the full 25 years that we usually give killers in Canada. We let them out early, apparently on good behavior, so that they could get right back to killing somebody else. What is wrong with this system? We need to actually have tests on our judges to make sure that they believe in enforcing the law as harshly as it needs to be. Because criminals do not need kid gloves, they need harsh sentences. In fact, some of them probably need the death penalty, and I, in fact, want to bring back that if I was in charge of things. But let's move on to another story, another fun one here. This one isn't about exactly a criminal, but it's still ridiculous that this person is on the court. Judge halts non binary persons' deportation to the US as Trump dismantles trans rights. Advocates say ruling could set an important precedent for 2S LGBTQ plus immigrants and refugees. This person, who has violated law, is here overstaying a visitation visa, is allowed to just stay because apparently they are terrified to go back to their home in Minnesota, run by Democratic Governor Tim Walz, because something might happen. I believe this person's a woman who identifies as non-binary, and then they take testosterone. What are they scared of happening if they go back to their Democratic state where they probably live in a very Democratic city? What's going to happen to them? What, they're not going to be able to watch men compete in women's sports? What's actually wrong here? What prevents them from going back? Anyways, another case. Let's move on to another one. Man accused of Stanley Park assault was granted bail hours earlier on separate charges. A man accused of attacking a woman on the seawall in April has been released on bail just hours earlier for unrelated criminal charges, court records reveal. So we have people committing a violent crime, assault on a woman, being charged, being let out of prison, committing another crime, and then being let on bail for that too. That seems like somebody who's not going to be reliable in terms of them showing up for their actual criminal trial for the first case, considering they can't stop committing crimes. The thing is, the whole idea of bail is that you should be in prison until you get sentenced, until the trial happens. In modern day, you can't really lock somebody up and force them to await trial for what could be months. And so what people do is they're usually supposed to put up some collateral. I will pay you a certain portion of the bail. I'll give you, 10% down. It's usually a percentage. It's always like it's 100,000 bail or it's, 50,000 bail, but you only really have to give them $500 and they will charge you back the rest if you violate your bail by committing another crime, and they'll take $50,000 from you. But you usually do that to demonstrate you have a stake in the game in coming back in order to actually face the trial because you think you're actually, innocent and you want to prove it. Or at least you're going to play by the rules to not get damaged even more. Letting a violent offender just out until the trial is insane because they've already proven they are potentially capable of violence. Not quite proven until we have the trial, but they are potentially capable of violence. And if they commit another offense, well, probably shouldn't be giving them a third chance, but for some reason we do that all the time in this country. And in order to actually hold someone in prison, because of the bail reform policies passed by Justin Trudeau's Liberal government and still enforced by Mark Carney's, prosecutors, who oftentimes can be part of the problem, and unless a good prosecutor wants to bend over backwards showing all the reasons why someone should not be released, they'll just be released. And even if you do all the work to show that someone shouldn't be released, a judge can still disagree and release them anyways. So prosecutors don't even bother because so many of these judges are so left-wing that even if you show that this guy has assaulted children, he's a murderer, or he's attempted murder before, he shouldn't be released, a judge can just say, I think our prison system is really mean to the incarcerated. The incarcerated is a term I see a lot from criminal advocates. The prison system is hard on incarcerated people, so we're not going to lock them up. So what's the point of even trying if you are one of the good prosecutors who isn't calling for 7-year sentences for people for the great crime of mischief, for having trucks parked on a completely empty street because you weren't even barely allowed to leave your house at this point? What do I know? Anyways, so let's highlight another one. let's just keep going because this could go. We could do this forever. Look at this one. Could see victim under car. Indian origin students sentenced to 3 years in jail in Canada for hit and run could face deportation. These two killed somebody in a hit and run, and they are only going to be given 3 years in prison. 3 years for murdering somebody. And then the byline, hopefully they weren't like acting concerned about it, they could face deportation. These murderers, maybe it's third degree, maybe it's just manslaughter, but these people who killed somebody are going to be potentially deported after serving their 3-year sentence, probably out on 1 for good behavior. What is this? This is not justice at all. And this, again, is why conservatives need to take this issue seriously. I don't want to be too pragmatic about politics. I'm really not a pragmatic person. I think you should just do what's right because it's right. Obviously, you don't set yourself up for failure for no reason by sounding off on everything all the time to the point where it's hard to actually, like figure out what your ideological through line is or what your main message is. But this is a big one that conservatives should be using a lot of their bandwidth to promote. The idea that judges are letting murderers, they're letting rapists, they're letting all these crazy people out onto the streets without actually being criminally convicted or with very light criminal convictions and light sentences. We should be trying to actually roll back a lot of this by appointing better judges, by finding ways of removing judges that have proven themselves to be incompetent in upholding the law, people who are not interested in upholding the law. We should be, locking up criminals and not having our grocery stores, our convenience stores having to lock up tubes of toothpaste. That sounds like a good idea to me. Not having to lock up razor blades and other basic items because people are going to steal them, because the people who do steal them, if they get caught, are going to be released 5 seconds later and they're just going to do it again. One of the big surges in crime across Canada has been in the area of retail theft. It's been violent offenses and retail theft. Those things are up massively. And now I want to cut back to Pierre Poilievre because he has been highlighting this recently, and it's good for him to be talking about, because this is absolutely insane how much crime is up, and nobody really talks about it in the mainstream media, or at least they don't talk about it properly. And even he was talking about another one of these cases recently that I didn't even talk about yet. Poilievre here says, another violent attack from someone who is out on bail for serious offenses. Repeal liberal catch and release laws to bring sanity back to our justice system and safety to our streets. And it's Brampton man, 20 charged in London, Ontario, pot shop shooting, was on bail. And even then, I would say Poilievre probably needs to highlight, we need better judges. We need judges who actually have the ability to use their own judgment to prevent violent offenders, to prevent repeat offenders from getting back out and doing it again. I think retail thieves, after your 3rd or 4th offense, should just be locked up for 5 years or 3 years. Make it debilitating the amount of time they get locked up, because then they will stop doing it. This is my background. I don't talk about it that often because I often find getting too much education is a bad thing. I have a master's degree in which my research paper was on crime. It's not poverty that causes people to commit crimes. Yeah, kind of. It's a very weak correlation oftentimes. The big thing that causes crime is weak family structures, poor educational attainment, and the biggest one is not enforcing the law. If you don't enforce the law, people are going to start gaming the system that allows them to be let out onto the streets right after being caught. But let's get back to Pierre Poilievre. He's also said, gun crime up by more than 130% after a decade of Liberal government. New Stats Canada data shows. Stop going after our hunters, farmers, and sport shooters. Jail the violent criminals, gangsters, and gun smugglers to bring back safety to our streets. Another one he said was, New Statistics Canada data today shows the Liberals have overseen a 54% increase in violent crime in 10 years. Hug-a-thug policies have brought violence and chaos to our once safe communities. Repeal the Liberal catch and release laws to jail criminals and stop the crime. That is, again, a message I absolutely support. But again, we should be pairing that up with get good judges onto the courts. Yes, we have this fake nonpartisanship in terms of who gets appointed as judges, but it's an executive decision in Canada. It is the government, it is the Premier's office or the Prime Minister's office who is determining who is going to be appointed as a judge. Technically, it's the Attorney General, but the attorney generals serve the leader. And so, if we are going to appoint judges this way in this country, we should be appointing people who maybe aren't conservative, but when they see a violent criminal who is not remorseful, they are going to absolutely throw the book at them and get as high a sentence as humanly possible placed onto them. But, anyways, oh, that should be it for me today, guys. I definitely will be back tomorrow with more content. But yeah, this issue is absolutely insane, and I probably will be covering whatever sentence Tamara Lich and Chris Barber end up getting. Again, the funny thing about all this, and I can bring up my own tweet about it, they're not even the leaders. There was no leaders to the Freedom Convoy. In fact, the person who started the Freedom Convoy was Bridget Belton, who no one remembers because that wasn't really the point. We weren't really supposed to remember who the leaders were because it was just a bunch of people showing up. It's kind of a quirk of like the JCCF and other groups showing up and they wanted to have figureheads to talk about. And it was just the quirk of how everything worked that Tamara Lich and Chris Barber had access to the biggest social media profiles for the Freedom Convoy. They had access to them, even if oftentimes they didn't even start them. And they end up becoming like the figureheads, and now they're being charged as leaders. But they're not actually leaders. Again, if they just went silent and left Ottawa, it would have just kept going on because people were doing it because they were ticked off, not because anyone told them to do it. It was a movement. Bridget started, a bunch of people jumped on, and then it really shot off. It wasn't because a political organizer showed up and said, we're going to do this, and then everyone started doing it. Some random lady bravely started doing it. A bunch of people jumped on board, more people jumped on board, and then that's the only way you can describe it. Just more people kept jumping on board, like one after another, and then it became like the biggest movement in Canadian history in terms of protests. But anyways, again, that's it for me today, guys. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, do all that fantastic stuff. Really helps me on the algorithm, and see you guys tomorrow.